youth, and especially people of color. You know, we do seminars, we do webinars, we do conferences, and we work with churches and other non-profit organizations just to be sure that we have things on track with families. We believe strongly that when families are okay, when families are, you know, in a good place, our society will be in a good place, and that's our nation. It's my utmost privilege and honor to partner with Joshua Elbers and Lawrence Lewis to host this event. Thank you very much. Over to you, Joshua.
Are you muted, Josh? Go ahead.
This is going to be a panel discussion for all of you guys that are joining us today. And we're just going to go ahead and jump right in. Now that we have everybody that's on the panel introduced, I'm going to go ahead and start the first question off with Mr. Lawrence Lewis. In 1 to 2 minutes, please give me your thoughts on the role that police officers play in society today.
I probably won't need more than about 10 seconds. For me, it's a simple role. The police protect the sheep from the wolves. That's it.
Okay, okay, that was a pretty simple answer.
Should I tell you who the wolves are? Obviously, Detective Washington and I'm very grateful that Detective Washington has decided to come on and be with us and share his experiences. He and I met when I was defending folks charged with murder, and he had either played a role in the investigation or was the lead investigator. So Detective Washington and I probably spent about 15 years together in the courtroom trying to figure out who was responsible for somebody. I'm talking about who are charged with the major crimes, the murders, the armed robbery, the kidnappings, the trafficking in children for sexual servitude. Those are the folks that I call the wolves in society, and ultimately the police protect the sheep from the wolves. Who are the sheep? The other folks that really have no clue what's going on. So that's what I think the role of the police is.
Okay, thank you so much for that. On the same question, on to Mr. Ramey.
Yeah, I'll watch mine. You watch
No, but you got everybody. That's the good one.
Well, I would just agree with Mr. Lewis that is the role of the police officer in society, is to protect those who can't otherwise protect themselves. To some form, be the external compass, moral compass for what people lack on the inside. That's why we have to have police officers in society, to keep things in some form of decency and order, so we can enjoy our daily lives without fear of being attacked by anybody else.
That's a good answer. That's a great answer, actually. Special Agent Washington, did you want to add anything on to that?
No, I think they covered it.
And Dr. Fisher.
Well, I think part of the issue to have to look at here is it's an extremely difficult job, as I see it, because as we get into more complexities in culture, we have more complexities in how do you identify who is who in the accurate identification of sheep and wolves, as well as, again, the roles that people are playing at different levels of our culture, of the structure of the policing agencies. And then we have to look at the psychology of people, because I think we have a lot of issues going on that police, even in some ways, are parents to some in some communities. They are big brothers. They are the agents that are examining things. They're preventers of problems as they may see them coming, and they are the unfortunate enforcers. And because there's so many overlaps in the different roles that people play, it's extremely hard to understand the complexities. And then they're also players of the game. And what I mean by that is that we have to look at that our justice system in so many ways is an unfortunate game, where we're trying to make sure that people who have committed crimes are paying the price. But it's really, to me, about, it has to be about learning and growing from the mistakes we make, not just about punishment. And when you're put in a role to police and enforce, and you have these more hierarchical structural views of this is the way it is, follow these rules, versus I think a lot of times officers see, when they know the people, and they should, to me, know their community, they see that this method of being so authoritarian won't work. They need guidance, or some people do need structure. We have to have room to understand the people in the community, the parents, the officers, the people who are in charge of those agencies, to really work together more collaboratively. So in that way, I think we can look at, real simple answers. But my frustration as an outside viewer of the system, in having done testimony and having seen the policing issue, is really understanding the concept of how do we navigate this game so everybody wins? Because I think when the police feel like they're losing, that raises a whole nother level of issues of, can they do their job? And can they feel confident and be able to do their job successfully to look out for our best interest?
Yeah, and I completely understand what you mean by that. It's based off of the, what's been going on, in the country, post George Floyd, and even before, with other cases that have made the headlines. It brings me into my next statistic that I wanted to share with the panel here. When we look at what's going on in society in terms of not just police shootings, but the amount of people that are dying from gun violence, whether it be homicide or suicide, and even, I have this on here just to show, the major difference in the numbers. I know that it's a different form of how people are dying, but overdose deaths, and to see that the amount of people that are dying from overdoses is significant. A new number came out today that I don't have on the screen that goes up all the way to 71,000 people for the year of 2019. But when we're looking at the rate of police-related killings by race, you see that right here, you have a lower amount of people, but the amount per million is higher than it is for a Caucasian versus an African American male. So, speaking on these statistics, I want to start with Officer Ramey. What kind of things or behaviors make you as a law enforcement officer nervous when you're interacting with a suspect or a person of interest, whether it be pulling somebody over or somebody that's in the jail, somebody that's, you're investigating? And I want to then, after you answer that, point that over to Special Agent Washington, and then to Mr. Lewis, and then we'll end it with Dr. Fisher.
The things that make me nervous when dealing with an individual is not so much related to race, not even the sex, but the non-responsive individual, the one who either won't answer, won't cooperate, or if they're giving an answer, it's one where it seems to have nothing, and it winds up being more of a, I guess when I get into dealing with mental health issues, that's my greatest concern. That the next individual is the one who has an issue with the police officer from the beginning, no matter how nice or how decent I am being toward that person. The person who just seems to be determined to be defiant and rather just let me do my job. So hopefully I can get this thing resolved right there on the spot and we go about our business. that individual causes me the greatest concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ramey. Mr. Washington?
Yes, so there are a lot of factors that come into play when you talk about police interacting with people and the signs that someone may or may not resist or may offer some type of violence during that encounter. The biggest thing is when a person is not responding to your orders or commands to do something. Turn around, put your hands behind your back, sit down, whatever orders you may be giving. If that person is not responsive to that, those are all indicators and signs that there may be some type of oncoming attack or fight, or some type of medical issue at play.
Okay. And Dr. Fisher?
I think you're bringing up extremely valid issues with mental health and understanding each approach. Before I continue, can everybody who's not on the panel please mute your phones or iPads or everything? There's sounds of cars in the background and things, so it's cutting in. Just want to make sure that everybody else make sure we do that. Because I think, again, when we look at the issue of mental health, I can understanding just being a police officer can feel very scary. You have to look in charge. You want to make sure that you're professional, you're respectful, as well as, again, understanding all the dynamics of any situation. And when police officers may not understand aspects of mental health, there's an element of training, but it really requires an in-depth level of training. Is this person psychotic? Are they sociopathic? Are they having anxiety? Do they have post-traumatic stress? I can tell you personally that I've had a couple of people through my 30 years of doing work who, because of their post-traumatic stress, reacted in ways against an officer that resulted in them getting more further attacked and compounding their stress. There's so many factors that have to be looked at that we have to be careful not to just make a blanket statement about people who we judge to be criminals and people who we say are bad officers, because that's not true. Every situation is unique. So I think in that, the level of stress and respect, I think we need to acknowledge of every officer out there in the job they do, of what brought them to that job, their history, of the history of the person that they're in interaction with, and those two colliding sometimes of those two events of the history of the individual and the history of the officer. I think that to me is critical in really examining this whole issue of why we're having the structural issues and behavioral issues and outcomes with policing these days.
Thank you, Dr. Fisher. Very thorough answer. The next question that I have, and I want to start with Mr. Washington. Do you think that police officers are different from the general population? How so and why?
Well, the doctor can speak to this more eloquently than I could, but in its simplest terms, it's not. Because police are a part of the general population, just like everyone else. The only thing that separates them from everyone else is the profession that they chose. The intimate interactions and access that they have to the underbelly of society, that happen in our communities that no one else sees. The crime, the fatalities and traffic accidents, the domestic violence, those are the only things that separate police from the general population. So no, they're not different.
Mr. Lewis, what do you think about that?
I think for me, it starts with who ultimately chooses to be a police officer. I think there are a lot of different motives behind why ultimately people become police officers. Some people become police officers, only stay police officers for a very short time. Other people become police officers and obviously make a career out of it. There's nothing, I don't think there's any one thing that you can point to that'll say this person is going to be a good police officer or this person is not going to be a good police officer. But what I can say, and I saw that Kyle Jones has joined us, is that I've learned in sort of having conversations post George Floyd that either the screening process or the training process has to weed out those people who are very comfortable with revenge. What's that mean? If we get into a fight and I put handcuffs on you and you're sort of under control, I'm still not sort of shifting my mindset into a preservation of life mindset, which is the term that Kyle Jones gave to me. I'm still in the, we're fighting mindset. And so when you say I can't breathe, I say, so what? You shouldn't have started fighting with me in the first place. So I think that mentality is something that has to, that when you start talking about screening, you have to screen for that mentality. When you start talking about training, you have to recognize that that the officer that fights with the person that gets them under control, that person might have to be tapped out, and then somebody else has to step in and then assume control of the situation once the person has handcuffs on them. I think it's just going to be about, I know I wouldn't make a good police officer. I already know that, you understand? Because if somebody passes me a little bit too fast, too close on the highway, I'm chasing them. I mean, it's just a mentality. And so you have to begin. I mean, some people don't understand themselves well enough to know that about themselves. Some people just shouldn't be police officers because they don't have the ability to shift gears like that. I chase, I fight with you, and then I turn into a person that life. That's not even how my mind works. And that's what I look for with a police officer.
And you bring up a good point. It brings me into a follow-up question for you, Dr. Fisher. Do you think that police officers should either, one, need more educational background before they're able to become a police officer?
See you next time.
If everyone could, if the people that are not talking, if you could please mute your microphone.
Okay, Josh, hold on. I'm going to mute everybody and then I'll unmute the panelists. I've done this a couple of times. I don't know why some people keep unmuting themselves, but please do respect us. And if you are having a side conversation, please do not unmute yourself except you have absolutely a reason to answer a question. Please, let's respect each other. Thank you. Hold on, panelists. I'm going to mute everybody and then I'll unmute only you guys.
Okay, and so that's my follow-up question, Dr. Fisher, that Mr. Lewis brought up a good point. Do you think that it should be necessary or recommended that maybe law enforcement should have a higher degree of education before they enter the force, as well as maybe a mental health and psychological evaluation? I know that those things are already present, but do you think that maybe a more thorough evaluation in mental health and psychology for, prospective law enforcement officers should be required?
I think, to me, the evaluative process is really the most critical up front. I know in what I do, and you all each may know in your profession, that there are some people who are just more gifted and more able without necessarily the education. It's in their bones, to do what they know how to do and do it well. And if we can look at each officer and each level of law enforcement, each level of the law enforcement system as being an investment in our community. The time we put into people up front is critical to the outcomes we get. It's the same investment we make in our teachers that we have to see. And I'm going to bring this across because, to me, we have to see the overlap between the education our kids are getting from when they're young, that they're spending a lot of times, more times in the schools, and how are our teachers teaching in terms of helping kids to understand themselves emotionally, relationally, socially, and how are families then engaged in that, then all the way to the law enforcement system that is supposed to be able to guide, not to control. So as we look at these pieces from a bottom up, and then we look at the idea of screening properly, and then when we see issues, not just negating somebody because they might not meet a certain threshold. There's some thresholds that, yeah, somebody might not be appropriate. There are other thresholds in terms of testing that may be educational in nature. So you focus your education on somebody like Lawrence talked about how, you don't think you'd be a good police officer because of X, Y, or Z. However, in certain situations, you may be the right person. So it may be that we have to, from a training standpoint, help you to understand your issues of approach to power. And that's what all this is really about, is the ways we approach power and our emotions that we respond with and how we view them. Because at that level, then education becomes part of what we do to implement a better across the board and having that spectrum of people with different skill sets rather than having one size fits all.
Yes, absolutely. We're going to jump right in to another question here. And this might be a controversial question, but it is one that has been popping up a lot on social media, in the community. There's this term that somebody driving while black has become an issue in society, to where it's seen almost as a stigma that some young African-American males and females are afraid that because they are African-American, that they have a higher risk of getting into a confrontation with a police officer. I want to start off this question with Mr. Washington, just based off of your experience in law enforcement. What do you think that this term means? And do you think that it is a valid fear for young African-American people, or African-American people in general, to feel when they're getting pulled over by a law enforcement officer?
Is he allowed to answer that question personally also?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Since he's black and he drives.
Yeah. So obviously, to Mr. Lewis's point, I am black and I do drive, and I have been stopped by the police a few times. That is a term that people use, and unfortunately, there are some places in this country where people will feel that and have a valid point based on statistics, based on investigations, based on data that's compiled over many years. But to the opposite side of that point, Josh, I would say the best thing that you can do whenever you're driving a vehicle is make sure that you are abiding by the rules of the road, making sure that you have your driver's license, making sure that it is not suspended, making sure that you don't have a warrant for your arrest, that your tag light is not out, your tail light's not out, you don't have any drugs in your car, that you don't have any guns that don't belong to you or that are stolen in your vehicle. These are all different types of things that you can make sure that if you encounter police, that the encounter goes as it should. At some point in time, it's likely that you'll be stopped by the police for speeding, for running a red light, for failing to signal. But that's the job of the police to enforce the law, to enforce the rules of the road. And it's your job as a responsible citizen to prepare yourself for that encounter with law enforcement. So here's what I do when I get stopped by the police. I roll down all my windows because I have 10 on my windows. I turn on the dome light if it's dark outside. I put on my four-way flashers to make sure that police officers know that I acknowledge their presence. I slow my speed. I pull into a well-lit area, i.e. a gas station parking lot, somewhere that's safe off the roadway if I'm able to do so. I go ahead and get my driver's license out of my wallet because I know that's the first thing the police officer is going to ask for, so that I'm not fidgeting and looking around in my car when the officer is standing next to the window. And the most important thing is I'm courteous to the officer. You can, like the old folks say, you get more with sugar and honey than you do with salt and vinegar. So I don't have an attitude with the police. I'm not yelling and screaming, asking them why they pulled me over. I'm sure they're going to let me know that once they make their introduction. And I have been cited by the police, but but I'm still sitting here before you today. So everything went okay. And no, police don't know what I do unless I tell them.
Have you ever had an issue with the police that you felt like you should have made a complaint or filed a complaint?
I would say no, but also I have been stopped by police officers that I thought personally weren't as professional, as kind as I may have been, or, you know, I would have hoped that they would be. But again, police officers are just like any other person in society. Sometimes you have good days, sometimes you have bad days. That doesn't mean that you did something illegal to me. It just may mean that you weren't as courteous as you should have been. So to answer your question, no, Mr. Lewis.
Do you think, and I'm just gonna assume control for 1 second, Josh. Do you think, because this is what I always thought, Detective Washington, that police officers will enforce traffic violations because the person is sort of violating the traffic law, but they suspect that there may be other things going on, like there may be a warrant, or there may be there may be other things going on. Did you ever get that sense that that's why they enforce? I'm a speeder, so we just got to get that out. So they don't stop me and I know exactly why they pulling me over, because I'm a speeder. But I'm saying generally, like if you trying to obey the speed limit, you're trying to obey the law, do police pull people over for traffic violations to sort of verify that there's nothing else going on?
So, well, the initial stop has to be for something, be it a tag light, a tail light, a lane violation, speeding, following too closely, driving too slow, not having your headlights on, a cracked windshield, a busted tail light. There are hundreds of things that police officers can make a stop for. But if you're investigating crime, which is the primary job of every police officer in this country, using a traffic stop as the initiation of an investigation, they're well within their legal limits to do that. So you can stay out of the way of that by making sure that everything in your vehicle is legitimate.
Well, I think you've given a great kind of tutorial on, you know, what to do correctly when you get pulled over by a police officer. And I think that was one of the missions for this actual panel, is to kind of educate parents, people, adolescents, young people, to understand, you know, what it is that needs to happen when you get pulled over and how to try to prevent, I guess, these escalations. But that also leads me into the second part of that question. And I want to direct this for Dr. Fisher, is why is it that you think that most people, irrespective of race, you know, because I know that I've been pulled over, and I feel like most people have a sort of nervousness, even when they're not doing anything wrong, that, you know, it's just kind of like a natural reaction for almost everybody, I would say. I can't say everyone, but most people get kind of nervous when they get pulled over by the police. Why is it that you think that is?
Well, you know, I often talk about is that even though we're one person, we often react and respond from many different ages and times and places in our life. We often associate the police as people of status power, with authority. They, in essence, in that moment, become our parent. So in that time, when we may feel that if we did something wrong or not, but we see lights go on, or we pass on and we have that question, what emotions are evoked within us, and how does that affect our perception of power in that moment? Often there's guilt. Did I do something wrong? And that results often in a quick release of adrenaline, of norepinephrine, excitatory neurotransmitters that send our level of anxiety a little higher. That's one part of it. The other standpoint is if we have a history with feelings of guilt, shame, failure, blame, our emotional pump is already primed to react and respond. So then what I tell people is you're not responding from your current age often, and this is really important for law enforcement to understand. You're responding from often a little kid place, a defiant teenager place, a flippant, young adult place, to where we're responding emotionally, not looking at our own social cues, because our emotion in essence has taken over. So because so many people are really not socially aware and even personally aware of their emotional reactions and responses, they can fall into these patterns almost beyond their will or desire or want because of that triggering. The other side of that, conversely, is how does that law enforcement officer respond when they run into somebody who might respond a little arrogantly, defiantly, angrily? Here are my 7 protective emotions that I teach: anger, rage, arrogance, flippancy, defiance, sarcasm, and hatred are always, always protective, meaning they never come first and they never come alone. So whenever anybody sees somebody behaving with one of those emotions, they're protecting something. It often is guilt, shame, failure, fear. And that has to do more with the models of power. I'll probably get to in another question. I don't want to take too much of this time, but I really want people to understand that the power of our emotions in those moments for everyone involved. And that's why there's so much turmoil these days, is because of these emotions. So long story short, Josh, that's kind of why people respond to me is really the emotion, and really being able to learn to read our own emotions in the moment. And in that moment, as somebody who's in a position of authority, to have the insight and capability to fastly look at who your audience is and read what might be going on with them, why you still have to assess risk. That's a difficult ask for anybody to do.
Hey, Josh, can I jump in for a second, please?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Go ahead.
I'm going to go back, piggybacking off of what Dr. Fisher just mentioned, in that you referenced the mental health evaluations of law enforcement. Mm-hmm. That's one area that I don't think we've done a good job within law enforcement. You have your initial psychiatric evaluation when you're hired as a law enforcement officer, but there's no ongoing psychiatric evaluation unless you're involved in some type of deadly force encounter, for the most part. I personally believe, having been in homicide, having been, a robbery detective and the department spokesman in Gwinnett County, that so many things happen on a regular basis every single day in this country. Even right now, while we're sitting in the comfort of our offices and homes, officers are out answering 911 calls. And people aren't calling 911 because their cat is in the tree. So they're seeing some of the most heinous, violent things that this society has to offer. And so I personally believe, and I'm sure the doctor would agree, that officers should have at least psychiatric evaluations every 6 months. Just check their temperature, make sure that there aren't any things that are bothering them that may be able to be ironed out.
I agree, and I'm glad you brought that up, because after I finished the answer, I realized I neglected really to respond on your side of the police officer, the law enforcement officer side of it. There's a saying I often use, is death by 1,000 paper cuts. And when you look at post-traumatic stress and trauma, you can have somebody who has experienced 1,000 small traumas that add up to the essence of one big trauma. And if the theme is the same, it erodes that person's ability to feel safe, their ability to trust. It results in chronic increased stress levels, higher levels of excitatory neurotransmitters, which wear out the adrenal glands, all these physical effects and emotional effects. And you're exactly right. There might be a threshold where they were great when they came onto the job. They tested out perfectly, no issues, but over time, the system eroded them. Now, the difficulty is, how do we support those officers versus just saying, you're a risk, you have to get off the street? Because that encourages the fake good profiles, where people are going to say anything. That also encourages a culture where you have collusion among officers to keep their mouths quiet if they see a problem. We have to build more trusting communities, not to identify people and vilify them or point out only what's wrong, but to point out the things that are going on so that they can acknowledge the help they need, continue to maybe do their job in a modified way, or to have ongoing support systems and groups where it is socially acceptable and not stigmatizing an officer to say, I'm having a rough time and I need to work it through. because I know through doing my job, when people are able to release their stress and they work the issues through, a lot of the challenges fall away. They do, because they're not holding it all in. It's not that balloon that's going to pop. And that's something that as attorneys, we can help affect that, I believe. As judges, we can affect that in the system. As police officers, as agents, and even us in our community, to say, we have to respect the challenge of the job that people we want to look out for us have, in order to support us through and be our collaborative friends and neighbors and partners, versus people who feel like they have to watch their back all the time. And that's unfortunately what I feel like a lot of people may be feeling, or officers may be feeling these days.
Can I ask
Josh, you also had, Josh, initially during your question was part of why do people get nervous or have that reaction when they're encountering a police officer. One of the things that was frustrating for me as an officer is the culture created by bad officers. That's the biggest thing, because even when I was just off duty out and about, I have to be very, very conscious of the fact that I'm a Black man. And having worked side by side with many, what I would term bad apples, my reaction is that of nervousness whenever I'm approached by an officer. The difference is, as Mr. Washington stated, to be kind and courteous. I spoke to Mr. Lewis some time back, and one of the things that I've had to learn is that no matter what type of day this officer may be having, when he or she approaches me, I learned that it is bigger than I am. And I have to sit and realize that I have to live through this situation. And one of the things with me living through the situation is, Lewis would say I'm old school, I carry an ink pen around with me. And I learned that at the end of the day, if I can live to tell the story, I can write out everything that happened. The sheriff, the chief of police, the city council chairman, the county commission chair, all of those people you can copy in this complaint against these officers. It may not get the officer out of office today, but there needs to be a track record where you don't need 30 plus complaints in an officer's file. That's the sort of thing that leads to a great deal of mistrust in the community, because this officer is bad. The supervisors know who every bad officer is in an agency. At the beginning of the year, when the shift rotations come around, every supervisor sits there with his or her finger crossed, saying, "Don't let me get this 2 or 3." The co-workers know who the bad officers are. And it is one of the things. It's easy to say we need training, we need all of these different things, but the truth is that we need to get rid of people when they show who they are. That's the biggest issue with policing and society, is bad officers not being gotten rid of until they kneel on somebody's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and then it's a problem. Now, and that goes into other stuff which you didn't ask at this point, but chiefs and sheriffs, I don't know what type of issues repercussions they can face from the governing agencies within the state. But if they keep holding on to troublemakers, there has to be some accountability from the top that would help cut out a lot of this foolishness. I have encountered officers out and about riding with my wife, just riding around, but I'm in a bad area. Okay, well, this is where my grandmother used to live before she passed away. My wife never met my grandmother. I'm taking her around, like, look, this is where I grew up at. These are the places. What you doing over here? I get asked this about 8 times during the encounter. And then when I let my department ID show, oh, brother, oh man, you should have told you, hey, he's good, he's one of us. and all of a sudden I'm okay. It doesn't matter that I'm still in a bad area. Now I'm cool. That foolishness has to go because it makes it dangerous for the good officers out there. And there will never be a good situation for the public to trust the police. And as long as that kind of stuff continues to go on, thank you. I know that's not all you asked, but that's my feelings on it.
I appreciate that answer because that brings me right into the next follow-up that I have from Mr. Kyle Jones.
Hey, Larry, Mr. Lewis, did you want to answer? I saw you would want to.
That's a question of both Deion Washington and Kyle Jones. Does the street have a shelf life? You know what I mean by that, right? Does riding around in that black and white and turning on the blue lights, does that have a shelf life? I find that most things have a shelf life. Raising teenagers is like, 7 years, 13, 14, 15. By the time they hit 19, you move on to something else. Beans, everything has a shelf life. Does riding around in that black and white, irrespective of whatever counseling you might get, does that have a shelf life?
Well, first, Josh and the panel, let me first apologize. I had to admit my father in the hospital at 7 o'clock this morning. That's for being late. But so I can go ahead and start answering the question. In my 25 years, I've known some uniform officers to have been there before I got there, and some of them are still there, and they do a good job at that. It depends on the individual. Change is good in every career, but sometimes you have that officer that's he gets accustomed to his neighborhood. He works his beat. He's familiar with his territory, and he really believes in community-oriented policing. And then on the other hand, you do have situations where some individuals get burnt out. I think that goes back to the question that was asked earlier, and a doctor brought up about these officers receiving psychological evaluations during the course of their career, not just at the onset. But to answer your question, Mr. Lawrence, I believe that it depends on the individual and what their career path looks like for them.
Okay, so when Detective Washington says, and I'm gonna keep calling him detective because he's detective for me, when he says that you should get the counseling every 6 months, yes, you to make sure where your head is based on what you're seeing every 6 months, you might agree with that, but you don't necessarily say at 5 years we got to really look at should this person come off the street or not.
Well, yeah, not 6 months. In DeKalb County, our officers got evaluations every year. And, as a supervisor, one of the things that we sat down and counseled them was, on what direction they wanted their career to go in. We counseled them if they had a certain amount of complaints and use of force reports. And working in internal affairs, we had what they call the early warning sign, that if individuals got a certain number of use of force reports and a certain number of complaints, we pulled them in off the streets and evaluated, the actions and try to come up with a corrective action plan to get them on the right path. As a commander of internal affairs, it was my philosophy, not so much the agency philosophy, to train individuals up or train them out. If they wasn't fit for the job, we had to get rid of them. So I say that every 6 months, to counsel them, you take a gauge on that and counsel them for their yearly evaluation and see what it is. But I don't think at 5 years you turn around and say, hey, let's just shake everybody up and move along.
I got a question on that too, about in terms of one of the issues I think we run into in terms of why corruption continues is because we have personal relationships with people, that the ethics, the values, the rule structures that are in place are often relaxed because we have these emotional connections. We might like them as friends. We have histories. We know their wives, their kids. We know the struggles they have. So we excuse that. How does one in positions of leadership in law enforcement, or how do we create the culture in law enforcement to say, we're in this together to help our community, and we have to see the value of making sure that people are getting help who need it, and that this friendship idea of moving somebody through or ignoring a problem because we like them is something that should be excused.
Yeah, well, Doc, now you're speaking directly, to things I have a great issue with. When you look at the command structure of the police department, the person in that department with the less amount of power is the police chief, because he's majority controlled by either the CEO, the mayor, or the city council. The sergeants and the lieutenants and the captains, they're the ones that are creating that culture that you're speaking of to protect the line officer, because i.e. maybe they policed with his father, or they policed with his mother, or they like him and they show him favoritism. That's the culture that we have to get in, and I always sought out to change. Irregardless of your relationship, I always looked at the individual, and I caught flack for that, but I handled and I dealt with that flack. But that's the culture right there that needs to, that needs to change. When I hear the terms of a supervisor saying, "Hey, my officer," or "my officer this," or "my officer that," he's not your officer. This is not personal. He belongs to the agency. He's there for you to supervise and make sure that he's out there doing the right things, make sure he's on his right path. But in no form, when you talk to him, and I hear him say, "My supervisor," they're already putting up to me that boundary of protection. Mm-hmm. I mean, from my experience.
So when we talk about annual evaluations, or we talk about 6-month evaluations, depending on what jurisdiction and what agency you're with, when people are starting to talk about police reform, defunding the police, I understand that you have a background in internal affairs. When you have a police officer or somebody that's beneath you that you're supervising that has, a certain number of incident reports, my question for you is first, what number does that number have to be before a review is done in internal affairs? And is it just something that's routine, or does it only happen when there's an actual incident that takes place?
So like with us, just to give you a for instance, we would look at the close proximity. Say if an individual got a complaint, one in a 3-month period, if he has 2 use of force or 1 complaint, we'll pull him in and talk to him. If in that 3-month period, if he has 3 or 4, complaints, we'll pull him in and talk to him. But as a shift supervisor, Josh, it's your job to pay attention to your officers and pay attention to, the individuals that are working under their attitude. You could tell when somebody changes. You could tell when somebody has personal issues going on, and your role is to pull them in, at that time and just kind of talk to them, before they get to that point. Or even if you see something out of character, my father told me that there's only 2 ways you get to know somebody. You either live with them or you work with them. And because those 2 ways are around them pretty much every day. And, you could take a look at the people in your profession and the people that you work around, Josh. You could tell when they come in and there's something that's not right with them. And, it's when those signs are signs that supervisors, ignore. And a lot of supervisors nowadays, aren't taking the time to, teach their officers how to deal with stress, how to deal with aggression. And they think, getting back to what the doctor says, "Hey, well, we're just going to shove it along because, we're friends and they'll be all right."
Yeah. So
what I hear you, I'm sorry, what I hear from you, Kyle, and I'm encouraged. I mean, I'm really encouraged by hearing you speak, because I hear from you values to me that are important in your position, which is integrity, honor, truth, honesty, and challenging people. And I think like it's hard to do that in a management position, but these are to me the characteristics I think about in officers that we want to engender and embody and even parent, because you talked about your dad and you talked about the values that your father and family instilled in you. And that's, again, so important, especially when we get into the issues brought up along in our discussion of what drives somebody to go into law enforcement. Is it that they want power over people? Is it that they want power with people? Is it they have issues of injustice they've carried with them that they want to play the judge, jury, and executioner? Or is it that they want to foster, I said, a community to bring people along? And this is, again, these are things that when I hear law enforcement officers and people in positions of management like you, I just want to compliment you and tell you I think it's great discussion that you brought up.
Well, thanks, Doc. And all those reasons why you say people get into law enforcement, it's just for all those reasons. They get into it for their own personal reason. And I can only share with you the reason why I got into law enforcement. And the reason why I got into law enforcement, I grew up, I was an at-risk youth, got in trouble all the time. I dropped out of high school and, I pretty much ran amok. I had a daughter at 16 years old. I mean, you couldn't really tell me anything. I was the youngest one of my mother's 7 kids. And I almost lost my brother out there to street violence. He was shot and almost died. And, that changed my life. I went back to school immediately. I got my high school diploma. I was the only one of my mother kids, to drop out, but the first one to give her a 4-year degree. But it's that tragedy that turned me, to law enforcement. It was certain things that I wanted to get out there. I wanted to, one, I wanted to save and spend time with at-risk youth and save our youth. 2, I wanted to become that officer that protected the community from rogue police officers because I was mistreated as a youth growing up, and I can understand some of that mistreatment. But even in law enforcement, I was stopped, and I was even mistreated at my own house by the police when I was a police officer in Gwinnett County, which led me to file a complaint on an officer, which was pretty much sustained. I think, Josh, to touch on a question when they talked about the saying of driving while black. When my wife had her baby, we had our baby. I said to my wife, man, I'm ready to have another one. She said, that's because you didn't carry this one. Labor pains are real. She's saying to me that I wouldn't understand it because I didn't have to carry that baby. When they talk about driving and being fearful, for African Americans, Josh, that is real. I can tell you as a father, I'm scared. When my 20-year-old daughter is pulled over by the police, I've been scared when my 31-year-old daughter called me and she was pulled over by the police in Stone Mountain, and I get down there and the cop has her pulled over behind a building in Stone Mountain, which he had no business having her pulled over. But he was later arrested and convicted for pulling over and, doing things to women that was inappropriate in DeKalb County. So it's a whole lot. The history that African Americans have suffered at the hands of law enforcement, brings on that fear on why, African Americans feel fearful when they're pulled over by the police or they have encounters with law enforcement, because you don't know which way it's going to go, and you could be as polite to them as you possibly can, but it's going to boil down, Josh, to that individual. And like they said on the panel before, it's a lot of bad seeds. It's a lot of bad seeds, and those bad seeds mess it up pretty much for the majority of law enforcement. The first and foremost purpose of law enforcement is not to fight crime. It's for preservation of life and property. The crime part comes along with the preservation of life and property. So it was interesting listening to this panel before I was able to start speaking. So if I touch on several different topics, it's because you hit a lot of good questions. You hit the nail right on the head with things that I wanted to speak about.
Can I ask a question, Deion Washington? Had you ever heard that term before? Because I'd never heard that term before Kyle said that. Preservation of life, that's the role of law enforcement. Had you ever heard that?
Sir. Yeah.
You heard that? 'Cause listen, I've been doing this. Listen, I've been doing this work for 25 years. That's just not a term I heard. And when people went like from the military straight into law enforcement, I was like, listen, I was infantry, and then I was artillery. And of course, let me just tell you, that term did not come up in basic training in Fort Benning, and that term, preservation of life, did not come up at Fort Sill. The goal was to separate limbs from bodies. The goal was preservation of life. So when he said that, he said it, and he was the second person in a week to say it. I had never heard that term from law enforcement before.
Yeah. That's primarily a law enforcement term that police recruits here in the academy. In an ideal situation, police always want to try and preserve life, protect life, and make sure that each encounter they engage with results into everybody going home if it's possible.
Yeah. You understand that I'm typically awake when I'm in court, and I'm typically engaged. So when 25 years go by and I don't hear this term, and I hear it twice in like 5 days, it sort of sticks with me. Preservation of life. I'd never heard that before.
Yeah, but it goes too well with the training, Lawrence. You know, even though the police officers are taught to double tap and shoot center mass, then everybody know the outcome of that is deadly. But you know what they're trained to. The training thought and the verbiage is to stop the stop the threat. And one of the things that you're taught is after you do shoot an individual, you know, you have to render aid to them.
And that's the part, Dr. Fisher. That's the part for me. Listen, you shoot at me, I double tap you, and then as soon as you down, I switch it to this other mode of running over to you helping. I'm sort of going to get a drink from the shooting. And that's the interesting conversation with me and Kyle. That's when I really realized I shouldn't be law enforcement. Shoot twice and then immediately run over to render aid. That was bipolar to me.
Sounds like you have some issues with grudges.
The judge,
we'll talk to my office later, all right? No, but that's the thing is that an officer to me has to be able to shift their role like that, and being able to train people to be able to adapt. It's adaptation, especially in that role, because you have to be able to determine how quickly is there a threat, how quickly has it been kind of calmed down, who now is a threat. And that's where when you look at domestic violence issues, who's a bigger risk to get harmed in domestic violence when an officer responds is officer from the female, right?
Yeah.
Now they're going to move to protect their spouse who they were just having this huge conflict with. So that's where, again, that ability to adapt, to read, to understand psychologically, to then be in a place of understanding. My job is I always feel like I have to understand where my person's coming from first, not me. And that to me is also a really key part of, of law enforcement too, because I think it's easy to become numb. It's easy to become, when I talk about power, I talk about two models of power. Hierarchical model of power, which is like a big circle to little circle. And then I talk about equity models of power, where we all have the potential for the same amount of power, so same size circles. Our culture is based in this hierarchical model of power. And it's based in the idea of having power over people. Or in that, it's based in often the idea of playing the victim. So there are roles that are played in that culture: victim, persecutor, rescuer, and then in that, the instigator. So I say we live in a victim culture because so many, you look at your job as an attorney is because you're the rescuer trying to rescue the victims, right? The police officer.
Or as I see it, I'm there trying to fight with the prosecutor.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So you're there to rescue them.
Yes.
And they're playing the victim. And then the officers, their job is to play rescuer, but then they become the persecutor. So we have to look at how these roles shift, because even in the victim, You can either learn to play the learned helplessness role, meaning you take the abuse and that's what you expect and you don't come out of the cage no matter what, and or you become the justified persecutor, meaning I'm a victim first and I justify my persecution of you because you tried to victimize me, okay? In this role, there's, I mean, like I said, I've written books on this stuff too, so I'm trying to kind of get it to the point because I think it's really important in this discussion to understand that one of the biggest things I think a lot of officers are trying to understand is I came in this role to help people. As we've talked about, there are the bad cops who come in to exploit and they want to have power over and they're waging out their own vendettas or psychological issues through their job. But so many people came in this idea to want to help, to be the rescuer, and it didn't work out. The problem is that it's the people in the victim role who are the most powerful. If I'm the victim, I choose who my persecutor is. I choose who my rescuer is. And that's where I explain the idea of the domestic violence police call is at first, the persecutor is the spouse who's abusing the victim. Then the officer becomes the persecutor because now that rescuer is potentially going to go to jail because they abuse that. So you can see how quickly these roles play and why it is so complex from a power perspective. And if we had more clear understandings and we talked more and had more of these forums to, like I said, I've loved Kyle's discussion and Dion and everybody who's in these roles of really sharing, this is what I've been through, this is what it's like. And we had people in communities engaged in understanding rather than judgment. We would have a different culture in society, and that is about equity. That's about finding balance and mutual understanding rather than judgment and blame.
Let me just tell you this, Doctor, so that you're clear. I asked at least 20 law enforcement to come on the panel, and just the time that we're in, the cancel culture, everybody's nervous about saying the wrong thing or saying the right thing at the wrong time. So the dialogue has sort of been squashed.
It takes courage.
Yeah,
it does.
Yeah, squashed. So I think the officers that came today.
Doctor, I agree with you 100%. Police, we don't generally do a good job of doing things like this. Unfortunately, the vast majority of time when people see law enforcement, something bad just happened. It's a person's worst day. They're emotional, and that emotional range runs the full gambit. And the time to foster communication is in an environment like this, where everything is okay. Nobody's mad. Everybody's happy. Everybody's wearing their best clothing. You can sip on your coffee or tea, and you can just sit down and have a conversation. I can explain to you my perspective. I can hear yours, and we can just exchange information back and forth. That's extremely critical that we get out into these communities, the communities that are labeled good, bad, and no named. And we make those citizen contacts with the leaders within these communities, from the clergy members to the leaders in every facet.
Well, and I think one of the issues we run into is I also talk about dichotomies and the ways we look at power. And that dichotomy means the state of cutting things into two. So the 4 dichotomies I talk about are good and bad, right and wrong, strong and weak, and win and lose. The ultimate dichotomy is win and lose. Now, how you get there is different depending on the person. Part of what I've seen shift in our culture in the last 4 years is more strong and weak being the way to win, because and here's why we fight wars. We fight wars to look strongest. And if we're strongest and we win the war, we define the good and the right of the culture. Okay. So even when I've been on CNN, I've talked about the 2008 elections, 2012, 2016 elections, and I always talk about those facets of the idea of battle and war, because it's a winner take all idea. There's no middle ground, and that's what's happening right now. Is everybody? It's either the police's fault or it's the victim's fault. It's the Antifa's fault. It's the right's fault. We're not looking at understanding all the pieces from an equity standpoint that go to feed the problem, and that's what I see as part of the justice issue. Is either you're guilty or innocent, and it's all or nothing, and that's a hard pill to swallow if you know from the law enforcement standpoint your person that you have formed this case against is guilty beyond the shadow of a doubt, but they either work the system, or if you're on the victim's or the accused standpoint and you absolutely know you didn't do it, but you got somebody out to make sure they're right because they have their their check lot, their belt that they're checking off their number of successful trials on. And that's again where we have to, I think, look at reform, not just about punishment, but about rehabilitation.
Yep.
I think
I wrote a note, Josh. I wrote a note here because it was sort of interesting. Dr. Fisher was coming at it from I guess a holistic criminal. My world is very limited. Deion Washington, homicide, rape, armed robbery. That's right or wrong. That's not the drug cases. That's not the rehab cases. That's not the send you to counseling. That's not the shoplifting. Our world is just somebody's dead or severely injured, and the punishments, the mandatory minimum punishment is life or 25 years. That's the world we live in. So it was nice that even as you were talking earlier, it's like, oh, that's right. That's right. Shoplifting is also a crime because that's just not a whole lot of what Deion Washington did. Deion Washington didn't go to the Walmart and put handcuffs on somebody for stealing a blouse. When he was there, somebody was dead. So our world is sort of limited to right or wrong because of the gravity of the offense. That's what I would call it. The gravity of the offense makes it more dichotomous. There's less room for gray because somebody's dead and somebody's got to be held responsible. Does that make sense?
Oh, I don't disagree with it at all. I totally agree. And so there's a yes, there is a guilt or innocence and not a but. Because again, we have these situations where our prisons are overcrowded. We have situations where they are sitting in there and they're stewing in their anger, rage, or hatred or vengeance, or they're just not learning. And what are we doing to help understand that there are still mitigating circumstances that don't negate their action? Because I always say there are explanations for behavior, not excuses. I say that with the people I work with all the time. And we have to have the understanding so that we can make sure not only are they out of society where they can't do harm, but they're also in a place where they can potentially work on the issues or get the support system. And we just don't throw those people away because of what they've done. And I think that's where we need to look at our system. And even like I said, I think that's how law enforcement sometimes feels. They made a mistake because something happened. They had an offense happen. There were mitigating circumstances, and they're out of there. And then they're alienated. They're alone. They're abandoned. And it's not about, like I said, excusing it. It's about understanding the whole picture.
Yeah, and speaking of right or wrong, of having to have that idea of, you're either right or you're wrong, and, just kind of taking that and putting it into perspective currently with the scenario that just recently happened back in June with the Rayshard Brooks shooting here in Atlanta at the Wendy's. This question is directly from Mr. Lewis, and the reason I want to get his perspective on this is, as a criminal defense attorney, you're having to constantly review discovery. We know that the video, the body cam footage of the Rayshard Brooks shooting there in Wendy's, there was a full 49 minutes from different angles. And when you, as a criminal defense attorney, are having to look at discovery, to prep a case for trial, kind of break it down for us about what it is that you look for and what kind of things do you try to see, whether it be interactions, whether it be, specific things that might catch your eye, red flags, when you're trying to either, prep for trial, and what kind of things do you look at specifically for this case where you did have an officer involved shooting, and, what was going through your mind as a defense attorney if you, for example, were to put yourself in the position where you were having to defend the police officer, and vice versa?
I think the first thing for me is I do my discovery at the office. I don't take a lot of this stuff home. I think that the cases have a certain energy, and I don't want homicide photos at the house, whether the children are going to look at them or not. I'm not involved in a Rayshard Brooks case at all, but I probably looked at that video about 4 or 5 times, only because there's so much comment going on about the video where people are talking about, and I keep reading it in different articles. He fell asleep. He fell asleep. He fell asleep. I don't think I've read one article where it says he's drunk. He passed out drunk in the line at the Wendy's. It's okay. He still, it should be shot if that's your position. But we don't have to make up a story that involves how the police came into contact with him. You don't have to say he fell asleep if he's passed out drunk. So we watch him drive the car a little bit. We watch the exchange with the officers. And this is where I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of officers about what's going on in that video. I spoke to one officer, and one officer said, listen, I wouldn't have shot because there was another officer there that could have shot in the event that the first officer that was chasing got tased. There's Kyle's version, and Kyle can talk about his version. Kyle was like, I would charge him with murder because of the what happens after the shooting, the preservation of life. And so from my point of view, when I'm looking at it, I always end up looking at the video, I'm gonna call it 3 or 4 times. I've got to look at the first time just to get an overview. I've got to look at it the second time to figure out what I missed. I'm looking at it the third time to sort of try to figure out what the defense is going to be. I'm looking at it the fourth time to look at what the jury might see that I might be missing as a defense attorney. So sort of when I look at the video, it appears to me that he's drunk, that he passes out from being drunk. He drives the car over to the side, and he is asking repeatedly over and over. He's being told repeatedly over and over, stay in the car, stay in the car, stay in the car, stay in the car. And he's not listening and not staying in the car. And I really couldn't figure out what was going on with him not staying in the car until the next officer comes and he's trying to insinuate that he's not driving the car, that he's not associated with the car. And then, of course, the first officer says, listen, dude, you just drove the car over. It's on body cam. Like, what's going on here? You can see that he's highly intoxicated. They ask him, where do you think you are? And he's like, Dixie Highway. You're not at Dixie Highway. Where are you at? I'm at Dixie Highway. Sir, say something other than Dixie Highway, because you're not at Dixie Highway. And then he wakes up about 20 minutes later and says, oh, I'm on University Avenue. That's right, sir. You're not on Dixie Highway. So everything is smooth. And I didn't think he was necessarily, when he's talking about the shoes, they're asking, hey, do you want to take your shoes off or leave your shoes on? They're new shoes. Okay, that's very nice. They're new, they're beautiful brown. Do you want to leave them on, or do you want to take them off for purposes of the field sobriety? And I didn't think he was necessarily being evasive at that point in time. It's a and the doctor can speak to this, some of it may be nerves, some of it may be intoxication. He was already on bond on a violation of probation based on COVID. He probably didn't want to go back to jail, but all of that to me seemed normal. That's what I'm gonna say. It all seemed normal. I've watched a lot of video until they go to put the handcuffs on, and the other officers can speak to this. That's when it becomes real. It's not real till the handcuffs go on, and that's where it sort of goes sideways. From my point of view, from the officer's point of view, and we'll see how it goes ultimately if they get the trial on murder charges. You see the officers deal with this person for a number of minutes. Was it 40 minutes before there's anybody going sideways? They're talking to him politely, everything is going smooth, and then they lose the fight. And this is where Dr. Fisher will understand part of my motivations. Listen, you just clocked me in the head 2-3 times. I've tased you. You grabbed the taser. Okay, you turning back, and you might use the taser against me. What? No, I'm probably gonna be firing that weapon. And this is when Kyle comes in. Kyle says, right after you fire the weapon, go render what? No, I'm gonna go back and check on my other officer before I worry about rendering aid. So when I saw it, and there are other officers whose opinion I've read, they find it a perfectly justifiable shooting. So I can't tell you it's a justifiable shooting or it's not a justifiable shooting. I can just tell you from the point of view of the officer officers arrive and it's all race. I didn't see that on the video. I didn't see that. I saw the officers try to handcuff him because they thought he was impaired, and he basically beats the officers up, and he grabs the taser, runs away, and ultimately he's able to use the taser. And that's what Ramey and I were talking about in the office. You know, how far does that taser run? Because that's a real issue. If that person's running away, and I know the taser only goes 21 feet, there's no reason for me to discharge the weapon if he's 23 feet away and he's running away. All I have to do is stop. Yeah, he's not going to run but so far. So there's no reason for me to use deadly force there. But if he's within the range of the taser, if I'm at 10 feet and he's got his back to me, I'm probably going to be okay discharging that weapon. And that's how I would come at it with the jury. He's within the area of the effectiveness of the taser. If he's tased, he's going to be immobilized, and then the officer may end up losing his gun, and everything may really go sideways from there.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. At this point, we're going to take a break from the discussion and take some questions from the participants. The first question I have here is from Miss Joy, and I think this was regarding something that was said earlier. She says, what needs to happen to train police that when they're approaching an individual, they can somehow be able to assess a mental health issue as different from a crime, you know, and well, I'm not sure I understand her second part, the second part of her question. It says, does he always need to be a police officer? But I think the main thing is what needs to happen for police to be trained such that they're able to distinguish between someone that has a mental health issue and somebody who is actually committing or has committed a crime. Anyone can answer that question, please.
That's out of my range.
I don't want you to answer.
Yeah. I like to try to answer the question for you. Being that now, since I've retired law enforcement, I do a lot of work with behavioral health and drug and alcohol treatment centers, and I work with Clarkston Police Department and several other police departments in after the Anthony Hill shooting to try to bring about more awareness in officers recognize as individuals in behavioral health stress opposed to a normal individual that's just acting out. One of the things that the training needs to entail right now in the academy, they may receive somewhere in the area of about 16-hour course, at some places an 8-hour course on mental illness, and the course needs to be longer, and it needs to be include like evaluations for when the initial approach on an individual with mental illness. When you ask them the first question or you see their behavior, you know, you can pretty much tell for me that something is going on with that individual, and that coordinates and dictates, you know, how I would handle them, how I treat them. In the Anthony Hill case, you know, I've dealt with a female that was naked during the course of the time of my career running down Wesley Chapel. And when the call dispatched and I was able to spot the female, I told radio to start EMS. And, you know, my sergeant came over the air and wanted to know why I wanted to start EMS. You know, then I had to tell them because I'm gonna wait for them to get here. Because when they get here, you know, I'm gonna put a bed sheet on her or confront her when we got a bed sheet. And my plan was, you know, to wrap her up in a bed sheet and then move from there. Just from her actions, I could tell that she was mental. And this was somewhere back in 1998. And it just surfaced again in my mind with the, you know, with the Anthony Hill case. With the Anthony Hill case, if you're not familiar, he is the veteran that suffered from post-stress traumatic syndrome, and he was having an allergic reaction to his medication, which caused him to unclothe himself and run around his apartment complex. And when the officer got there, only thing he seen was Anthony Hill running towards him, and he pulled out his firearm and shot him twice and killed him. You know, that opened my eyes up to the more importance of, you know, law enforcement being. Some agency has what they call a 1310 or more. It's a special unit, but all officers need more training you know, in the area, because out here, the majority of the people that you're going to encounter, you know, and that are in these jails, they all have issues tied to mental health. So, yeah, it's very important training that needs to be a high priority, you know, to every director of every police academy training facility.
Well, and I'll add to that, when you get into training, then you get into competency. When you get into competency, and attorneys probably see, then you get into potentially that competency being used against you in a court of law that you should have known better. So it increases potential liabilities along that way. However, let's just look at somebody who's running down the street, like Kyle was talking about. You potentially have somebody who could be psychotic, could be on drugs, could be drunk, could be having a post-traumatic stress reaction, could be being attacked by bees. You know, I mean, all these things to try to make a decision, a snap decision, a period of time. My job is to evaluate people over a period of time. And in that time, like I said, that somebody has to evaluate a situation quickly. You also have to be able to evaluate yourself, and the ability for you to be thinking rationally, to be able to sorting through all this data and looking at all these other variables. That it is an extremely tall ask to ask people without, again, I went to school, you know, for 10 years beyond high school to get my PhD, and I still take my time as I'm evaluating people, and through 30 years of experience, I'm able to do it quickly. So when we're asking people potentially who have, you know, some college education, then they're getting into psychology training, and then to make these determinations, it's a challenge. So I say, yes, do it, approach it. Make sure that we look at, we're giving them the skills to succeed, not arming them with liabilities to be used against them, because then you're taking the power away. You're undermining trust of the people who are supposed to look after you. You're putting them in situations to make judgments calls that they can't make because they can barely even determine what might be going on with a family member, let alone a person who they feel a threat or perceive a threat by.
Well, and one of the things I guess to consider is, now I've completed a couple of mental health courses, gone through the CIT training in order to recognize certain signs that individuals might give off during an encounter. But it might help if the public, if you are going to call the police and somebody is acting out, then it would not hurt to say, I think this person may be going through some type of a psychotic episode, because if you report a crime, then generally any wise officer, when they approach a person anyway, has to have that bit of hesitation, that bit of cautiousness. And they're dealing with first in their mind, what type of crime has this person committed? Now we find out, oftentimes it's too late, that this individual was going through some type of a mental episode. So when you make that call, you make sure you say, I believe this has to do with the person's mental health right now. And one of the things I even found after going through the mental health courses, I did my bachelor's in social work some years ago, is I dealt with individuals, particularly working inside of the jail. People have episodes, they're acting out, and it doesn't matter how nice, how well, how easy you try to talk to this person. Mr. Lewis might walk in the room, and we have deputies who just had that thing. They could walk up and they could get the person to do anything that they needed them to do. So a lot of that just has to do with the personality, or what that person picks up that they like. And unfortunately, with all of you may lobby your state legislators at this point, whoever your governing bodies are, to say we need to open up more mental health facilities again, get those things back on, find the funding from somewhere to make it so we have an outlet for people. Because you give a person suffering a mental health issue, put him in jail, now you have a criminal history, And now you're going back and forth, and he's going to increase the likelihood of having to keep interacting with police officers. And you have some officers where you're just going to be frustrated with this individual. And I've heard it said many times, all that person needs is a good whipping to make them get in line. And that does not help. That doesn't fix anything. But when you can't talk to a person, you can't make it make sense to them up there, and you don't have the compassion in here to just deal with the person, you wind up with oftentimes an abusive situation having taken place. And so that's a difficult road to navigate, to say just training and that's it, because as the doctor says that he's been doing this for years, and it still takes him to complete a process before he can make an accurate assessment. So that's kind of difficult. And you understand that police officers are normally there to deal with the crisis at hand. And that's it. Not there to spend a half a day, because many times the officers who've been out there on the road in particular, from the time they come on their shift until the time it's over, a lot of times they're answering call after call after call. They don't get a chance to sit down and enjoy a nice meal, a nice quiet. It's moving. And if you're on a call too long, depending on what it is, you'll often hear supervisors come across the radio. What's the status on this? And they'll go to one of the talk around channels. What is going on there? Why can't you wrap this up? So it's not often that simple to just say, well, I'm properly trained in this, now come on and we're going to get you to a doctor and get you some medication. It doesn't work like that all the time.
Thank you, Dr. Mr. Rodney. Does anyone have a contribution to that?
I guess my question to Fisher is, and sometimes I see it over. I live in DeKalb County near Kyle, and I'm driving home from work. It's like 2 a.m, and the guy is out. I'm assuming it's in front of his parents' house because I always see him there. And it's 2 a.m, and he's shadow boxing, and I'm like, is there somebody like to watch him? I mean, obviously all the neighbors probably know that this is what he does at 2 a.m, but he clearly has a mental health problem. I determine as I pass him at 25 miles an hour, he has a mental health problem. Obviously, I don't necessarily know that you want to chip him like a dog, or you want to, do some other thing so that law enforcement will know. And I guess that's the question. I agree with Raymond. You shouldn't be housing mental health people in jail. House them in a mental health facility, but the jail is sort of the catch-all. The question for me that I put to the doctor is, how do we convince the parents or the grandparents of people that have mental health issues to not let them just wander the street and let everybody else just guess what's going on when they're having an episode? They may leave the house and be fine, but they may have an episode in the road and nobody knows what's going on. And then of course, Washington, he's only been on the job for 18 months. He's pulling up, and this is the craziness that he's facing. Like, what do the parents have? Is there a way to, or maybe there isn't, but do you have any suggestions for, I guess, parents to minimize the 22-year-old officer riding up into chaos that they've already been dealing with for 22 years? He has no information other than what comes across the dispatch, and the family's got all the information.
So quick example of using your demonstration of using your example. Let's say you have a 22-year-old who has an autistic spectrum disorder, and he's got severe reactions to any time he's constrained, held, controlled, and now his way to work out his sensory processing issues when he's under stress is movement. It's called proprioceptive feedback. That's his way to get at his movement. So now a police officer rolls up sees them shadow boxing. The person isn't able to interact well because they have an autistic spectrum disorder, and then they react against the officer violently because they can't be constrained because of their sensory processing issues. That's a whole nother level of it's not psychotic, it's not trauma, so these are the things, like I said, why it's so difficult. So sometimes families are doing the best they can to work with the situation. What the best thing might be is that they contact the police around and they say, I have a son who's 22 and he's got these spectrum issues. I want him in my home because I can manage his behavior and he deserves to be home. Sometimes during the day or night, he might be out doing this to work off his issues. I had another parent years ago who I taught the son to go and walk off their stress. So the father and son moved to another area. They're not familiar with it. The kid's wanting to walk off the stress rather than blow up emotionally. The dad, who's afraid the son's going to get lost and or at risk for getting harmed, holds the kid down. The kid starts going ballistic and swinging at the dad because he's got his reactions, emotional reactions, which then causes a trauma and this huge emotional issues between the dad that is now only came out 5 years later. So these again are some of the really difficult situations that we're working with, and why community involvement is so important, why paying attention to mental health and having police work in concert with mental health practitioners, with community mental health, with DFACs, and having us work together as teams rather than silo everything. And that's my concern, is as we silo so many things, we want to protect the confidentiality of the individual. But if we build trust, then we'll have better teams. And if we have better teams, then we can, it takes a village, as that saying. I love that. And I believe that. So that's part of the issue of, I think, how we address the mental health issues. And just to take it a little further, every year I've gone to Haiti and I teach about community building over multiple days. And why I go there is because the model is that kids grow up perfectly imperfect. They are wonderful. They're unconditionally loving. They're slowly socialized into hierarchy. They're socialized into the dysfunctions of the culture. So by the time we become adults, in essence, we're kind of broken by culture and broken by the lessons that have been passed down to us by our parents and our culture. Then the teenagers are kind of being broken, and they're going to be the leaders of tomorrow. So in order to create a better world for our kids, we have to educate the adults in changing the ways they look at power and culture and structure. We have to build more community-based, collaborative-based models. We have to often teach them how to build infrastructures in the community, not just for families and for kids to grow up in safe communities, but also for business. So I teach small business development. And what I found year after year after year of doing this is that starts to change so that there's less conflict. Kids are getting better educations because they're not so focused on the abuse issues within their family or the violence that has happened within their cultures. And you're able to help those people in those cultures to see that. Now, why don't I do that in the United States? Because I feel like we're suffering from a process I call collective arrogance. Arrogance is the downfall of every empire throughout history, and it is destroying our empire. An empire is an arrogant term to me. So we have to see how through our collective arrogance, our denial of our personal responsibility for the issues, our family responsibility for the issues, our community and national responsibility for our issues, we are creating and feeding this chaos. So pardon for me for getting on my soapbox, I'll get up, but that to me is a real kind of a larger issue picture of how we really address these issues. And then the police issue takes care of itself.
Good.
Whoa, Dr. Fisher, I think you nailed it for me right there when you said collective arrogance, because I think that's the bedrock of a lot of issues that we have, and especially when it comes to police and community relationships. People who don't want to listen, people who want to become very defensive or just not cooperating, instead of cooperating with an officer, you've just made up your mind, you're going to give somebody a tough time. And the same thing happens on the other side. The officer comes to that same way, okay, we have to use the full force of the power that we have to show them who is in control here, and that doesn't take us anywhere.
What?
And there, what another issue I want to bring attention to is an issue of attachment. The quality of our emotional attachments that start in our family and extend beyond. There's so many kids I see whose behavior can really be more characterized, and even to young adults and adults, and we got, as burgeoning criminals are kind of evolving, they often don't have firm attachments. They need both masculine and feminine strong attachments, not strong power over them, but people who are supportive, reassuring, comforting, give lessons, not lectures, and collaborate and work with them. And that's where, if we don't address our attachment problems, then we're going to continue to perpetuate the communication issues, because people with issues with attachment don't really communicate well.
Thank you. So the next question I have here says, let me go back a little bit. When will we ever see the shift from incarcerating non-violent criminals, which is punitive, to the judicial system that would mandate mental health treatment, specifically for juveniles? So, is there something that would ever happen? Is there something that should happen?
Is that my question?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, I want to make sure I understand the question. Dr. Fisher has given me a great deal to think about when he talks about attachment issues and ultimately being broken by the culture. I'm sitting here taking notes and sort of processing it. When you start talking about juvenile, and I don't do a bunch of juvenile, most of the juvenile stuff that I do is juvenile charged as adult. So the juvenile has either committed murder, armed robbery, rape, or 50 kilos of cocaine. So the juvenile 15, 16, in Georgia, an adult 17 years old, the juvenile's being treated like an adult. The juvenile's basically in adult court. I've learned that although there may be a certain developmental delay, some emotional delay. So an 18-year-old may think like a 15-year-old, or an 18-year-old may behave in ways that 15-year-olds behaved, say, 20 years ago. There's some other things about that person's personality in terms of probably their attachment issues, where they're not going to listen. They're going to just do what they're going to do. And, Kyle gave you the example earlier. Nobody may have been able to tell him anything, but he probably wasn't charged with armed robbery, murder, or rape, because the system is going to deal with that in a very different way than the system's going to deal with the drug addiction. I think the legal system has changed over the last 20 years, and so the juvenile system, the juvenile judges, the juvenile probation officers are focusing a great deal on rehabilitation, counseling, drug treatment. But again, the issue is, what's the person charged with? And so there is a very, very bright line. If you're on this side of the line with a DUI or shoplifting or forgery, the focus is going to be on treatment. The focus is going to be on resocialization and counseling. If you're on the other side of the line, the murder, rape, armed robbery, there may be some counseling, there may be some rehabilitation, but as far as your initial indoctrination into the system, they're going to send you to the penitentiary, and then the Department of Corrections is going to be responsible for that, because the across the line, these certain offenses carry a certain punishment before we ever even get to your rehabilitation. That's the sort of general, and whether that be broken by the culture, however that is, there's a certain mentality. If you commit a kidnapping with bodily injury, or you commit an aggravated child molestation against a child, you're going to be gone for 20 years. Now, what happens in that 20 years, that's going to be up to the Department of Corrections. So I think there's just a differentiation between what I would call misdemeanors and maybe a light felony and more aggravated crimes. Aggravated crimes, Deion Washington and I, that's probably never going to change. Somebody got raped, armed robbery, home invasion, somebody got burned on the back. I mean, just horrific. The horrific stuff. People want punitive punishment, and then once they get on down the road 20 years, then you come back and we'll talk about whatever rehabilitation you want to talk about. But I think it is happening in juvenile court, even though I'm not there a lot. The counseling, the rehab, a lot of that is going on. I don't think it's as holistic as it needs to be, because I think they're talking to the children, and the parents are all jacked up too. The relationship between the parents and the children's jacked up. The educational system and how the parents have been interacting with the teachers is all crazy. So I think they're attacking from the point of view of trying to help the child, without necessarily attacking it from a holistic point of view. What's going on with school? What's going on with the parents, and giving counseling for everybody?
I still think you're throwing away life. Yes, they committed a heinous crime. And when you have a threshold, that you pass that threshold, that you disregard the history of that individual and you throw them away for 20 years and think that they're going to get any help. To me, we all have to acknowledge we all have value. We all have worth. And if because of an act, somebody who has had no stable parenting, potentially was abused or burnt or beaten or kicked out of their house or watched their parent do drugs or has been bullied in school incessantly and they had enough, we're feeding the problem because we've said you're worth of being thrown away. That's that dichotomous viewpoint to me that perpetuates the problems that then we have to see the inherent value of each person and know that inside of that teenager is still a wounded child. And that might sound all lovey and huggy. It's not, it's fact. It's what I work with and see every day. And people who other people thought were unsalvageable, who when you get to the core of their pain, they understand, they heal, they feel, they grow. And that's kind of, I hear you. And that's that Teflon side, I think that we have to be able to put aside to really work on changing the system.
And I agree. And listen, I agree with Dr. Fisher. The problem is on the front end of a murder, nobody wants to hear about counseling. So sure. The judge may give the person 20 years, and I don't say throw them away. I say, and I'm coming to this understanding, we can come back around and revisit that issue. But at the point where somebody's loved one is dead, nobody wants to hear anything but life for 50 years. I think you have to sort of calm that situation where you come back around and see what's going on with that person 7 years down the road, 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road. But I don't think that can be a conversation that anybody wants to have day one. I'll just be honest with you, Dr.
That's where we look at the idea of emotion. And what are our emotions trying to do? Anger, rage, hatred, vengeance. The idea that somebody has to pay a price for something they did, not understanding what the explanation, not excuse, but what brought this whole thing to this place because it passed the threshold. We have to look at our emotions and our understanding and how we're playing them in another culture that lead to nobody listening to each other, that don't lead to meaningful communication to find meaningful solutions. Because this is also going to help people not hide, not avoid, get help when they need it, rather than waiting until things explode and blow up and therefore create the job and a bigger job for law enforcement. Does that make sense?
No, listen, I agree with you. I just know that the system, when they hand down a 20-year sentence, there's a certain calming of the family who have been identified as victims who's lost their loved one. If you take my wife, I might get to the point of having enough emotional intelligence to calm myself. But a lot of the folks that are in the system, if you give that person counseling, you're going to have Deion Washington is going to have another body to go collect in about 3 months because nobody in that family feels like they got justice. So justice is, and I think you're right, but I think justice, broken by culture, the culture says justice is that person being incarcerated for a certain period of time. And at the point of the act and the punishment, I think that just has to play itself out, and then you revisit it. Me, I don't like to not revisit it. When a judge gives somebody life plus 50 years, and that sentence comes down, and nobody wants to sort of circle back around 15 years from now and see what's going on, because that person may have done something with that 15 years that they've been incarcerated to actually warrant them actually returning to society. But I think at the point where the judge hands the sentence, that's probably the most calming thing that can happen.
So I'm going to throw this out to the officers too. Yeah. Let's say now you have somebody who commits a crime against a police officer, an aggressive crime. They're able to get off on a technicality. Now they're back out in the streets, and all the other officers know that this guy committed this crime. They were able to get off on a technicality. They played the justice game. And now that they're out in the street and they know they got away because they played the victim to have no culpability in what they did because somebody else wronged them, how do police officers feel that affects their ability to feel taken care of, supported? How does that affect their sense of vengeance and revenge, anger, rage, and hatred, and injustice with those they're trying to protect and look after? So I'll leave it there.
I see Judge Deborah Luca here. I know she's not a member of the panel. I'm wondering if she has something to say.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I can't really respond directly to that question. I'm not a law enforcement officer, but what I want to say that is part of the conversation that so far I think is missing when it comes to consequences and punishment, that the judges are at the behest of what the law says for these more serious crimes, whether you're a juvenile being treated as an adult or an adult who has committed one of the more serious criminal offenses. The discretion in large part for those more serious crimes is taken away from the judge. I would love to have the ability in some instances to exercise discretion, because I don't think offenses and people are, a one-size-fits-all. But, if you commit an armed robbery and the prosecutor insists on prosecuting you for that offense and you're convicted of that offense, then the law says I start at 10 years, mandatory minimum, door to door, and I go up from there. So if you're a 15-year-old who has a history of abuse or neglect, a lack of parenting, you've been homeless, you have mental illness, I sympathize with all of those things, but the law doesn't allow me to. So, I think the conversation in this regard has to be broadened. People need to reach out to legislators. If you want judges to be able to exercise discretion in appropriate circumstances, then that's a conversation that starts with the legislature.
Judge, what happens if it's just a BB gun and not a real gun?
Well, again, people need to understand that judges don't choose the charge that an individual is facing. So we start a little bit further down in the criminal justice process. The charge has already been determined. And so once the charge has been determined, if there's no change in the charge, then the law tells me what the sentence range is. And that's where I am. I don't, in most instances on my own, have the ability to say, this 14-year-old has had a rough life. They made a bad decision here. I think they can be rehabilitated. So I, on my own, am going to treat this armed robbery as a lesser charge of robbery and give you a chance. I don't have that ability as a judge. And so people need to understand, I don't sit up there in a vacuum. I don't sit up there without the ability to empathize in certain circumstances. I don't sit up there without the thought process that I would like to treat someone different or would like to equalize the treatment of people in different circumstances, but my hands are tied.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Josh to continue with his questions.
Sure. I got one more question from the audience that I I want to direct for Mr. Lewis. It says, are there question about arrests regarding drug arrests? Do we think that there is going to be any changes that will be made for non-violent drug arrests and maybe consideration of rehab instead of jail? That's something that's implemented already currently with drug court. Is that something that's looked at from a different perspective when you have criminal clients that are dealing with strictly drug offenses, possession, use, rather than, that's a question from the audience.
I want to make sure I understand the question. The question is give me the question again. The question involves drugs and rehab. I think that when a person is on their first drug arrest, and that's all that there is an emphasis on trying to do two things. One, trying to get the person to curtail their drug use, and that's rehab. That may be drug court. That may be some other form of accountability court or DUI court. But there's also trying to make sure that arrest, if it's an arrest for drugs, doesn't follow them. And so there are programs like conditional discharge, which will get that arrest off your record. There's first offender, which will get that off your record. But typically, and obviously Josh has seen this while he's been with me, typically the drug offense will come as the first offense. That's the check engine light. The check engine light comes on, and then the client says, oh, I just want to unscrew the bulb, just resolve the case and just keep it moving. Do you want to get into the broken by culture? I like that, Dr. Fisher. You want to get into how you've been broken by the culture and getting into the drug use? No, I'm not worried about that. Just resolve the case. And so maybe you resolve it with a conditional discharge, and then they come back on a light felony, a forgery. That's the second light coming on. That's the omission light coming on. And they're like, no, I don't really want to address the dysfunction underlying that either. So you unscrew the bulb again and you just keep on driving. You understand? Somewhere down the road, the car conks out. That's the big charge. That's the armed robbery. That's the aggravated assault. That's the kidnapping, bodily injury. That's the home invasion. Well, now we get to Judge Fluka. Now the law says you got to do a mandatory minimum 15, and the person says, wait a minute, but I didn't have any notice, sir. You were notified back with the cocaine arrest. You were notified with the cocaine arrest. So people say this thing like cocaine, nonviolent. I don't really quite know what that means, unless what they're saying is they want to legalize all drugs. And I'm okay with you legalizing all drugs. Just understand when you legalize all drugs and drug arrests go down, domestic violence is going to go up. Because I don't know if anybody else wants to talk about this. A lot of the domestic violence has an alcohol and drug component to it. So once you legalize drugs in the broken by culture that Dr. Fisher's told us, and you legalize cocaine and you legalize marijuana, you're going to have more domestic violence. So I don't like the disconnect where people are talking about different things as if they're not interrelated. The people are living together. If he gets drunk or he gets high and he has, and what Dr. Fisher say? The attachment issues, those attachment issues are going to manifest themselves in domestic violence. So before you quit to run out and legalize drugs, make sure you understand what the impact is. Nobody's told me that, but my 20 years doing this has told me, you legalize drugs up and down because they're non-violent, you're going to end up with a lot more women harmed as a result of that. A lot more domestic violence, and most of the domestic violence is man on woman. But you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
So Josh, I have a question. How many of you all look at the media as being a strong component of the issues of police brutality we're talking about and the perpetuation of the problem that we're seeing right now, and why?
If that question is directed to me, I just think there's a disconnect. People are talking about different things at different times. I'll give you an example. I was on LinkedIn, and somebody said they were praising the mayor and praising the superintendent for going online schooling so that children wouldn't have to come to school. Okay, so they were promoting it. They were saying that was a good thing. Okay, that's a good thing because they thought the governor wanted to create a situation where there might be greater deaths in the Black and brown community. Meanwhile, in Tennessee, you have Black parents who are complaining that going online is some type of white conspiracy against their children to create an education gap. Listen, as a Black man, I like a level playing field. So if you're going to praise the mayor and the superintendent for doing online, then go up there and tell the woman in Tennessee, the Black woman in Tennessee, that we're doing this to protect her children also. You can't praise Black leadership here in Atlanta for the same thing that you're excoriating white leadership for in Tennessee. That's just not a level playing field. So I think what happens is the media takes pieces of what they want, and they exacerbate the piece of what they want, Rob, and they don't talk about it in any sort of interconnected way. We're going to legalize drugs, and we're going to also be part of the Me Too movement. Sir, if you legalize drugs, I think that you're going to increase domestic violence, and nobody's having that conversation. And that's what I really think is the problem. That's how I think the lack of interconnectedness in how these problems impact one another is I say is disingenuous, because I don't think I'm a genius. I think somebody else has to recognize this. So I think it's disingenuous, but it further exacerbates the problem as far as I'm concerned.
Deanne, what are your thoughts?
Doctor, I had a great opportunity and privilege to work with the media on behalf of the Gwinnett County Police Department every day as the department spokesman. So it doesn't take long for you to start to see that the media's job is not necessarily to inform the general public. That's just the breaking news headline. The job is to make money through advertisement. And it's the responsibility of you as a recipient of information from the media to understand that. And by understanding that, you have to know that I have to digest information from multiple sources and do my own research. And that's where the problem lies, because most people are too lazy to pick up a book and read it. Most people are too lazy to do their own research. We all generally want to be spoon-fed a certain amount of information because it's easier. It feels good. And unfortunately, you end up with 20% of information, 10% of factual information. And in today's hot, sensitive, emotional time, that just really leaves you very glass half full, like.
Mm-hmm. And, me and Mr. Lewis were discussing this the other day, about certain things that were going on in the media. And I strictly, I know I'm the moderator for this event, but I'm going to give my 2 cents on what I think, to answer your question, Dr. Fisher, is I think that a lot of people, just to piggyback on what Mr. Washington said, you're only getting 20% of the information, and 10% of it is true. The other 10% is nonsense, because they're not really showing you what, going into what Mr. Lewis said, they're not showing you the interconnection about what the problem really is. And I think that when you look at that, and you look at how people are actually absorbing the information that's coming from the media, they're not really trying to form their own belief on the matter based off of all the research that goes behind that information, but instead they're actually just taking that information that they've seen in a 15 to 20 minute clip, forming an opinion about it, and then deciding that they've become an expert on the matter. And I think that a lot of the problems occur when people don't really read, they don't want to learn, they don't want to research about what's really being portrayed in the media. Instead, let me just take CNN or Fox News or whoever it is at their word and not let me learn anything about the actual issue or subject matter that they're discussing. Let me just believe what it is that they're talking about, and that's what I'm going to believe, and that's what I'm going to portray to other people. I think that a lot of issues, I don't think that there's one single issue that can be discussed in a 15-minute clip for somebody to form an opinion on. I think that it takes at least reading 2 or 3 books before you can even form an opinion on something, because you have to have the knowledge to be able to do that. So
I want to realize most segments tend to be 2.5 minutes tops.
Right, but they take that 1 to 2 minute segment and then they play it over 60 times in a 30-minute period.
Well,
So,
and I think,
or 45-minute period.
I think that's where we have to look at the idea. The reason I bring this up is because I think we have to be careful not to only vilify the media. They have a tough job, but also they are a product of our culture and society.
Right.
They've also been used as a tool politically from both ends, from all ends of politics to be their voice box and their funnel. And if you then look at the history of media, the Hearst families and all the families who control the news, want to gain they want to corner the market on the news and things that I think that it's really important for us to be able to filter that again and look at their job is to evoke emotion. Their job is to evoke a following. They are building their customer base, and they also have, to me, a moral responsibility. And that's where we come down to the ethics and morals of where our country has gone in so many different facets of it. To provide information that is helpful, balanced, honest, true. And that's a difficult thing. So we have to take responsibility each for what we choose to watch, for letting the news know, hey, you're part of the problem, not all the problem, to let our politicians know you're part of the problem, not all the problem. And so I bring that up because I kind of hear that everybody does point at the media and say, yeah, they're a big part of this issue.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I don't think that the media is the issue. I think that the issue really lies beneath the people that are watching the media, the audience, people that are, like I said, they're forming a belief. It's not the media that's the villain. I think that the real issue lies with us as viewers in the audience being able to not just absorb everything that we hear, but then we have a moral obligation and a responsibility. If we're going to then talk about those issues with others, we need to make sure that we're not just quoting directly from the media. We need to pick up a book. We need to go look at a website. We need to read things. We need to study things. We need to educate ourselves so that we understand what it is that's actually going on with these issues that are being discussed in the media. So I think that I'm not saying the media is the villain. I think the real issue is us being able to educate ourselves off of what we're hearing in the media. So
the media.
I tend to agree with what Josh is saying. But as far as the media, I was, I guess, to some degree, a different type of police officer, had a different mindset when I got into it. One of the things I find is that the media, for the greater part, cannot be trusted to tell the whole story. And particularly as you refer to the police violence or what have you, and the police brutality, officers need to stop violating laws, violating policies. And that's not even my biggest issue. My biggest issue, because I have nieces and nephews now. I have other friends and family, those who are back and forth in trouble with the law. And the biggest thing is you stop doing things to put yourself into harm's way with the police officers. I understand that you can't control everything because when they approach you, that's one thing. But if you are conducting yourself in such a way that you're going to draw attention from the police officers, then it's kind of like when you go and skydiving, you're doing it at your own risk. And you know this. If you lived in America for more than 15 minutes, you know that there is quite a strong probability that you are going to suffer at the hands of some black and white officers. There are many bad black officers out there too. So we can't just blame what the media. If we keep throwing them out there, throwing them bones to put out there, yeah, the media will go ahead and sensationalize whatever they want to. But officers straighten up, people of color in particular, stop doing foolish things. The system is not fair. The system is geared to make the black. You know that. You said that. Stay out of harm's way to the best of your ability. And that will cut down a whole lot on what the media has to report. That was one of the biggest things that frustrated me in my career. I almost begged you, man, straighten up. But then once somebody comes and manhandles you, now you want to make a big publication out of it, but you don't want to tell the story that somebody talked to you for 15 minutes before they ended up having you spread out on the ground, fade, rubbing out there on the concrete. That, to me, that's foolishness. So we can't blame the media. The media, they're doing a job. That's it. They're making a lot of money. So what? Quit giving them something to talk about. That's the way I see this.
And you bring up,
Ramey, when you say straighten up, do you mean stop smoking dope? What you mean?
When I mean straighten up, when your kindergarten teacher told you, sit down, little Johnny, be quiet, turn around and face the board, take out your little notebook and get your pencil and your eraser. That means the same thing when you're 40, 50, or 60 years old.
and that's
Straighten up and behave yourself.
And Mr. Ramey, you bring up a good point, which leads to the final question, and there's going to be a good amount of discussion on this final question. So I'm going to leave it open for everybody. Whoever wants to jump in first on this question, I think one of the former law enforcement officers should jump in on this first. But when you look at everything that's happened over the past, couple of months, obviously coronavirus is, dominating the news cycle. We have George Floyd, who was murdered by the officer in Minnesota, turned into a big movement. But that's to say that this is not the first time that it's happened with an officer killing somebody on camera. And I bring it back all the way to 1992 when you have Rodney King and you have the Watts riots, and then you come all the way up to where we are now with 2012, Trayvon Martin. Obviously, Zimmerman wasn't a police officer, but then you keep going on up the ladder, 2013, Michael Brown, 2014, 2015, now we're in 2020 and George Floyd. There's a lot of media attention, and this is what's connecting this, is we were just talking about the media. There's a lot of media attention, there's a lot of protesting, there's a lot of all of this stuff. When we're looking at what changes law enforcement is going to be having to implement due to the issue that's now been magnified. It was already an issue, but now that it's an issue that's being magnified, what kind of changes do you think are going to be happening in the area of law enforcement post George Floyd? And then to follow up on that, who do you see actually now deciding that they want to join the police force? Who do you think do you think that number is going to fall? Do you think that number is going to go up? Do you think that people are now going to be afraid to become police officers because of the backlash that's gone on with police and this George Floyd incident? And looking at the history of it, what kind of changes do you think are going to be made post George Floyd? And who do you now see becoming a police officer?
The kind of changes, that's more political changes than anything else, is more insistent on body cameras. Those, they're going to find money from somewhere. Substantive changes, I really don't know. The doctor or one of those are going to have to give you a more definitive answer on that. But it's who gets into law enforcement now. You've had people who worked for different industries for a number of years. We saw a great deal of it back in the 08, 09, 2010 era during the recession, where you have people who thought they were in secure industries and they found themselves laid off. Then they went back and got downsized, so now they're out of a job. But they found out law enforcement, not the greatest pay, not the greatest atmosphere, but law enforcement has a place for you. Doesn't slow you down no matter what the economy is like. You're going to continue to draw a steady paycheck. We had a lot of guys to come in from other industries and fine officers. I mean, because these people are dedicated to working, paying their bills, and feeding their families. So you're going to get a lot of people post-COVID, what have you, coming in and saying, I can't go through these ups and downs in my employment. Those guys are going to make a good, firm base for you. Then you're going to have the guy who just needs a job just to make it to retirement. That's fine. The problem I see is the guy who's always wanted to be a police officer and is chomping at the bits, even still in this society. They're looking at Black Lives Matter as a movement, but they're not looking at the true mothers of the murdered victims who just say, I want this to be heard, it must be heard, we must get justice and equal treatment. They're looking at the hoodlums and thugs who have taken on the moniker of Black Lives Matter, and they want to get in there and they want to instill discipline and straight. You're attacking our officers, and we're going to get in there and we're going to straighten that out. You're going to get a lot of problems there. And that is going to be probably the biggest headache, I believe, in the next couple of years as officers come on, those who've never been in the industry, because they're already going into it, in my mind, with the wrong attitude. You're not going in to just enforce the law. You're going in to correct these people. That's not your job. That's up for the law. The judges are the ones who implement the law and put it into actual effect. The district attorney looks at what laws have been violated and they say, well, this is what the charges are. But the officer who wants to instill discipline to people who are running amok, those guys are going to create a bigger problem, and it's going to cause this thing to get worse before it can even start trying to get better. And one thing that you didn't particularly ask, but you look at other agencies where the district attorneys have said, we're going to file charges against these officers, we're going to make this swift, we're going to do it quickly. And now you want to leave those agencies, and other agencies are opening the door, say, come on, you're already certified, you're good. The only officers that are leaving one agency to jump to another agency because of fear of prosecution are the trash officers, who are the officer who goes to work every day, does his job, and treats people like somebody. That officer does not go to work thinking, I'm going to get prosecuted by the DA today, because my history, my record speaks for itself. And if I get into a bad situation, there are going to be enough people in my agency to at least say, no, you need to take a thorough look at, because this is not that type of officer. So law enforcement is up for a long ride before we see things get any better at this point. That's just the way I see it.
Mr. Washington, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so my hope is that from a law enforcement standpoint, we get to a place where we appreciate and respect the ultimate objective of a lot of the protesting that's happening. It's a quest for equality. It's a quest for, just feeling as though the police are on your side, and that they're not targeting, they're not maliciously attempting to arrest and deprive you of freedom. But the flip side of that is also the general public has to understand that law enforcement has a job to do. We don't live in a utopian society in this country. Make no mistake, there are a lot of things that happen out here that the news does not have time to report. So most people will never see about it, they'll never hear about it, and they just won't know. But the police know about it, and we have to go out here and confront those harsh, cold facts. And that's just the truth of the matter. I think that the result of this is going to be a stronger emphasis, of course, on body-worn cameras, because they give us insight into policing that 10 years ago we didn't have. It was just what Mr. Lewis would see or what the judge would see on a police report based on the officer's memory. Now we have more insight because you can actually pull up a video, it has sound, and you're right there. You almost have a first-person account of what took place. In addition to that, we need a stronger emphasis on more community policing initiatives. This is nothing new in policing. Unfortunately, when someone does something negative all the way in Minneapolis, it affects officers in Georgia because people see one badge. They don't make a distinction that happened there. Every police department is not bad. Every officer is not bad. There are a lot of sustained efforts that have been made across this country in communities that are impoverished and that have to have the police because they're preyed upon. And there have been great strides and great successes that have been made and documented. But it seems today you take, 5 steps forward, 3, 4 steps back because of this particular climate. But I hope that we can get to a place that, again, in an environment like this, we can do more things like this. The police can get out and make contacts with people outside of enforcing criminal law. We can get into schools, initiate youth development programs where the police are able to interact on a consistent basis with programs like the GREAT program, the DARE program, so that people can see the human side of policing, again, aside from criminal enforcement.
What do you say to people that want to see the police defund the police?
Well, to Mr. Lewis's point, I mean, that's a very loaded statement to me, defund the police. A lot of people just mean let's shift the resources to other areas to take off some of the burden that police have been tasked with, to maybe fund the area that the Dr. Fisher works in, so that there are more mental health options available for law enforcement. I agree with that. Police need all the help that they can get, but I don't see that as defunding them. They need more funding so that they have those tools at their disposal when there is a mental health issue, and they're able to pick up the phone and call a trained doctor that can respond to the scene to assist. But the flip side of that is you're talking about rapidly dynamic situations that are evolving, and time is not often on the police's side. So
yeah, and I think one of the issues that society is facing right now with that statement, like you said, it's a loaded statement. A lot of people don't really understand what it actually means. I'm not sure that I actually fully understand what it means, because I've heard a lot of different opinions about what it does mean from different individuals. The question now for Dr. Fisher is if the police were to actually, like you said, add resources and then potentially reallocate them for mental health, Dr. Fisher, do you see that as being a plus in your field?
Absolutely. I mean, it allows us to, as mental health practitioners, to work side by side with law enforcement, to leverage our skill sets with their skill sets. And that's, again, that comes back to equity. And that's what we have to see is it's not about who's in charge. And it's if we look at what's happened in our business organizations over the last 20 years, we've seen more of from a vertical structure to a horizontal structure of management. You're looking at leveraging the skill sets of your employees and using what they do well to work together to build team output. You actually don't have to pay people as much when you empower them to work as a team. Our antiquated view of this hierarchical structure of the way we're looking at things is what's being perpetuated in many ways by those who are in power now and feel afraid to lose power. So if we have people in younger levels of power who have kind of growing up more towards equity, more towards collective management and utilization of skill sets together, we're going to see a lot better outcomes across the realm, because we'll say, okay, here's your expertise, help teach me, and then extend that beyond where we need you the most. So, and that's where I said, when I talked to Mr. Lewis he said he didn't be the ideal officer. I said, no, in certain situations, you might be the perfect person they need to call in with the certain situations because you deal with things. And Mr. Washington might be another perfect officer to call in to deal with a situation. That's why we have to understand our skill sets. And again, realize how much emotion has been used with this word defund. And that's what we have to recognize, is how much emotion runs our culture, our world, our media, our police, our criminals, and we don't give it the credence and the recognition it needs. And we think we're thinking through things logically. We're not. Our stock market is not logical right now. It's all based on emotion. I'll just take it there. So when we're able to work together as teams, see our strengths, and see how we can find solutions together that are long-term meaningful, I think we will save money in the long run. But it's the transition. Anytime there's change, there's fear. Anytime there's change, there's turmoil. You know what? Look how much we've changed in the last 40 years. And look how much we're changing now in the computer age and industry. And look how much we can still go. I want to have us see the potential, because people in power feel afraid right now. And that's what we have to recognize, a lot of this. And we feel afraid of where we're going. But let's pull together as stronger communities and see what we can do together to make meaningful differences rather than feed the fear, the turmoil, and the chaos. And I think we'll all be better for it.
Beautiful closing argument. Mr. Lewis,
Yes.
that's the last, right? Well, what are the final thoughts that you have? Final thoughts.
It's interesting. As I listen to Deion Washington, we've known each other for a while. You talk about what needs to change. I think from the conversations that I've had with people, and Dr. Fisher may say I'm a good officer. Yeah, I may make a good officer back at the office when you come in, but on the road, I'm probably not going to be that good an officer. But what I've come to understand is that thing that Kyle taught me. See the force, mitigate the problem. You got to stop the problem and then immediately render aid. I think that has to be the focus of law enforcement. You got to train the officer to deal with whatever the danger is, but as soon as the officer deals with the danger, he's got to turn into a nurse. He's got to turn that's not an ability that I particularly have. I think that you have to find people who have that ability. I think that's one of the larger changes. It's sort of interesting when Deion Washington says everybody's going to have body cams. Okay, I need to explain some things so that everybody understands. A 35-hour armed robbery or 35-hour homicide, 35 hours of prep from my end, is now turning into 200 hours because I've got to view all of this surveillance video and I've got to view all of these body cams for a person that's made a full confession. So the officers might be saved in the end because they've got this body cam which will support and defend whatever decisions they make. But the lawyers are going to be burnt out because when you take a 35-hour prep and turn it into that's 1 week, 35 hours, and turn it into 4 weeks of prep for the same charge, you end up, lawyers will either burn out faster or lawyers will decide that they're not going to prep as they should, because that's a lot. I mean, I have probably 4. And 10 years ago, I didn't have any cases that involved 200 hours of prep. I'm talking about 4 or 5 weeks of prep. I didn't have any. And now I've got like 5 in my office where it's just going to take months, weeks and weeks into months to go through all of the video and all of the surveillance to get ready for trial. Dr. Fisher, I have no problem with that. Just know that when the prosecutor says something and it's not true, I'm going to get them. Just know that. Because that's a lot of hours for me to spend reviewing all this video for you to say something for me to just sort of forgive that. No, I'm going to make you pay for that. Josh knows this. Josh said a little joke about me and he's like, how long are you going to stay with that? I'm very vindictive. I'm going to stay with that for a while. I'm going to be, now, of course, it helps my client because if they say something wrong and I can disprove what they're saying, but it also, that amount of energy that you devote to prepping, I think it divests you of that bipolar thing you're talking about. Oh, be forgiving. No, I've got to make all this prep I had to do. I got to make you pay for that. I got to make you pay for that. So that's part of the vengeance, revenge thing, competitiveness. I mean, it's been called competitiveness, but I'm beginning to see it for what it is, which is why I'm coming to understand I probably won't make a good officer. It's been called competitiveness for years. My wife called it being ultra competitive, but it's a little bit more than that. And so I think the change that you're going to see is in terms of the officers that you select. And I think the biggest change that you can do is attack the black on black crime, because as long as you put an officer on the street and the officer sees that the community that he's serving doesn't value life it's going to be hard for the officer to value life. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's how I see it. I think we still have to talk about, you know, community involvement and people not killing each other.
Then we need to strengthen the family.
Absolutely, I agree with that. Josh knows. I always say, commit to the woman that you're having children with.
Well, I think that's a piece of advice that everyone should take. But I'm gonna go ahead and first of all, I want to thank everybody for Dr. Fisher, Mr. Ramey, Mr. Lewis, Mr. Washington, Mr. Jones. Thank you guys so much for joining this panel. I'm gonna pass it over to Bola at this time, and I think she's got some stuff that she wants to announce. Maybe open it up with the audience. But that concludes the moderation portion of my job today here on this panel.
Thank you so very much, Josh. And again, I want to thank every member of the panel for a great discussion. And I also want to especially repeat what Dr. Fisher said. We need to strengthen the families. Incidentally, that's our focus at Parenting Resources and Initiatives. We're looking for ways to, you know, come alongside families, strengthen the families, strengthen the communities. If the family is good, for the most part, the community will be good. The police will not be so overwhelmed. And then maybe people like Mr. Lewis won't have jobs anyway. But again, it comes back to, you know, like the adage, it takes a village to raise a child. You know, I know there are educators on this call. I know there are non-profit activists, there are church leaders here. If each one of us in our various roles and places determined to help and pay attention to the youth in our care, the youth that we relate with. Because like Dr. Fisher, no, not Dr. Fisher, I think it was Mr. Raymond that said that, you know, it starts from when your kindergarten teacher tells you to sit down and you sit down. You know, when you start from there, you learn obedience. You follow constituted, or you respect constituted authority. It adds up, and it's a big piece of the puzzle. For the most part, it determines where a child would end up. If there's a kindergarten child that's constantly, you know, not obeying, not following authority and all that, we can very much predict where they would end up without intervention at some point in time. So again, the charge here is let's strengthen our communities. Whether you're a teacher or not, whether you even have kids of your own or not, we all have youth around us. We have young people around us. We can make it our passion. We can make it our duty to help, to put them on the right path. We direct those who have already gone off. And for those who haven't gone off, let's ensure that they don't go off. Again, I want to thank everybody. Thank you. And I want to thank George. Deborah Fokla, I hope I'm saying your name right. Thank you for chipping in. Thank you very much. And I want to thank every member of PRI, Femi, Foluke, Bola, Steve, Achenyo, Ngozi, Ade, Afra, Valerie, and Bemi. Thank you all for doing what you do and for, you know, being a part of this thing. We look forward to having another conversation in the near future. And if you're in the audience and you would like to have information or connect with the people on the panel, you can privately send me your information, maybe your email address, where we can reach you, and we can also share the link to this recording. It will be posted on YouTube. So feel free to message me right here, put your email address, and we will send you whatever information we have. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.